Well, thank you all for coming. Let's have a prayer. We'll be talking about class 3, and we'll look at that. Dear God, thank you for this time. I pray that you guide us. Help us to be able to, that this will be important, and this not important, but to be help us in understanding the scriptures and what went on during this time. I just thank you for all the history that you've given us to understand that you were part of history. You are actually the person that's your history. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so what we're going to look at today is the intertestamental period. What you've got is the Old Testament was written from the beginning of time until about, hello Landon, Clint. Hello. The beginning of time until about 400 BC or BCE. BC means before Christ, but if you don't believe in Jesus, they said AC. No, they said BCE, before the Christian era. So you've heard that now. AD is about the same. Anyway, because they don't want to talk about Christ. But it means in the year of the Lord, so I don't know. Anyway, this particular period is the time, including Jesus, which is the time of history between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, and then you have Jesus' history. So this is what we looked at before, if you remember. Just looking at all these historical things. We start at creation, you go to the flood, you go to Abraham, born in 2166, which is approximately the best timing we have, I think. And it's about that time when you can really start saying when something happened. 2066, Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. Jacob was born when Isaac was 60. And then you keep going and you find out Joseph was born in 1915 BC. And Jacob's family are in Egypt about, it's supposed to be 1876, around there. And then Moses was born about 1526 BC. We talked about the Exodus where they went through the Red Sea and they come out of Egypt because there were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And then after that they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1406 actually probably when Joshua took them out. After the wilderness, then the judges come after they conquer the promised land. And then you have the kings. You have Saul, first king in 1050. And you got David, King David, the second king in about 1010. Solomon, the third king and last king of the United Kingdom, they call it. Not England. United Kingdom means it was united, it hadn't divided yet. This was the kingdom of Israel here. And then at about 931, Rehoboam, Saul's son, was going to succeed him, but he was very, very harsh on the people. And so 10 of the tribes left, and they formed the northern kingdom of Israel. And the only 2 tribes that were left in the southern kingdom were Judah and Benjamin. But they call it Kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom strays away from God. If you remember on that slide that I showed, that almost all their kings were bad. Whereas in the south, it was a mixture of good and bad kings. So sometimes they were following God, sometimes they weren't. The people in the north basically didn't follow God at all. And in 722 BC, Assyria came in and conquered them and deported them into Assyria. The southern kingdom kept going until about 586 BC, and then it was attacked by Babylon, and Babylon took them into exile, into Babylon, the leaders, and then we're going to start here where they're going to come back. The southern kingdom is going to come back. This over here is a continuation down here. That one doesn't go anywhere. So this is the time we're going to see. We're going to cover this time to the end of the chart. Any questions?
Do we know any, why did the Assyrians stop just before they Do we know why?
They went down to the south. I think that was when, you remember, am I right? They went and tried to take Jerusalem. They weren't able to because, was it Hezekiah? The king prayed to God, and they were right outside Jerusalem, if I remember right. And that's when they had 180,000 people die of their military.
Wow.
And so, or was it, I think it's 180,000. And so they just retreated. So I'm not going to take this. And so they just left them alone until, I think that's right. Double check. So they didn't, Assyria didn't go on down. The Syrians were very, very brutal. If you go over to the museum in London, historical museum, I'm not sure what's it called, British Museum, you can see a whole wall of rock where the Syrians showed what they did. They carved it out, what they did what they did to Israel, and it just shows them taking them in shackles, taking whatever they did. But it's just a victory type wall that they transported back to the British Museum from the Middle East, where they found it. I'm trying to figure what the technical term for that is. But anyway, so the southern team kept going, and then the Assyrians were captured and attacked by Babylon. So you got another country there that is taking over, and they come in, and they're successful at taking over Kingdom of Judah. So we go here, go here, go here, go here. Where are we going? Okay, so we're going to be starting there about the walls, building of the walls and temple of rebuilding. In the captives start coming back about 538 BC from Babylon, but now it's not Babylon; it's Persia. So Persia took over Babylon, and they still had the people that were transported out there, and now they're coming back. If you were here last time, remember that Isaiah predicted this 200 years before, that this guy named Cyrus, who's going to be king, is going to rebuild Jerusalem, and it's going to start up again. So at 538, a lot of the captives begin to come and return from Babylon. By 515, they had rebuilt the temple. The temple wasn't very big. It was a small, compared to Solomon's temple, which had gold laid over everything just about. It was incredible. But when they conquered it, they went out and took all that gold off, took it over to Babylon. Now, over here, this time in here, 430 BC is when Malachi was probably written. So you've got the rebuilding of the walls and the temple. The temple is rebuilt in Ezra, and in Nehemiah you've got the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem to protect it. So there's one more prophet that prophesies in the Old Testament, which is about 430. Now, in that period from 430 to 330, about 100 years, we're going to talk about that, as well as others. So we're going to talk about the Intertestamental period, Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and the Maccabees. So this is going back over to the left part of that bottom one, when this is what Cyrus, king of Persia, said. He read in Isaiah that he's supposed to do this, supposed to help the people come back and rebuild Jerusalem, and rebuild the walls and the temple. And so he read that. He said, wow. So in Ezra, they record what he said. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you. This is started, right? Did you start it? Okay, great. Just want to make sure I forget. Any one of the people among you, it's a square. It's a round thing, it's not square. Is that right?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. Because I want to let people hear. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let them go to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And so, there they come. They're coming back. You remember, why would they go up this way? That's Mesopotamia. Why would they go that way? Why didn't they just come straight across?
It's an arid desert.
It's a total, yeah, you'd probably die trying to cross there. I think there is a road through there somewhere now, but it's crazy. So they went up where it's not as bad, and weather-wise, and came down there. So they're building Jerusalem's walls. And now we're going to look at Cyrus to Alexander, the Persian period. Persian period is about 540 to 330 BC. Cyrus, the guy who sent them back, and Ezra and Nehemiah really covers this time, rebuilding the temple and Jerusalem walls. For 200 years after Cyrus, the Persians controlled Judah, but they allowed the Jews to carry out their own religious practices. So they were kind of free to do what they wanted to, but they were still under control. Judah was ruled by high priests in this time. So the Jews came back, and they just reestablished all their religion, and temple, and the walls around Jerusalem. And so they were basically doing their own thing and not bothered. Then in 330, we have what's called the Hellenistic or Greek period. And this is quite a period. Alexander the Great, and you've probably heard of him, he conquers the Middle East. It was basically all the known world of the day. And he claims everything clear to the Indus River. And we'll look at that in a second. By the time he was 26 years old. Would you like to be emperor of the world when you're 26 years old? He conquered Palestine in 332. He Hellenizes the world and makes Greek culture and language a common world language. Now this is important because when the gospel comes, when Paul comes, and they're going to spread the word of God in Greek, all these people already knew Greek. How did he Hellenize the world? Which means he brought Hellenistic culture. It's interesting. He named or renamed from 20 to 70 cities after himself, where he conquered. So they were all named Alexandria. So you got Alexandria here, Alexandria here, Alexandria here. And he had those cities practice the Greek culture. He brought in the Greek gods. He brought in everything that pertained to the Greek world. And so they had to speak Greek. And I think also they had to use Greek currency. I think so. So it was just a whole change of culture that he brought into all these different cities. Have you ever had anybody name you after a city?
No, I haven't. But did the Jews still have the same religious freedoms that they had under Cyprus, under Alexander's reign?
Yeah.
Kind of.
We're going to look at that.
Okay.
Just a second here. He Hellenizes the world and makes Greek culture and language the common world language, which we have like English today. We've got classes for students all over the world. They're in English, except for the Spanish people in South America. Spanish for them. But it's common. It's so common. Around the world, it's incredible. Almost everywhere you can speak English, and they'll understand you. At least someone there will. So he names these cities after himself to make all this Hellenization happen. He sets the stage for communication of the gospel to the Gentiles by Paul. If you got a common language, it's so much easier for the gospel to go. Alexander the Great dies when he's 32. And his empire is divided up into 4 areas among his 4 generals. 2 of them founded dynasties and ended up ruling Palestine in different periods. They were the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt, and the Seleucids, who ruled Syria and Mesopotamia. So we're going to look at those guys. But before we do that, this is an old map. The Indus River is clear over here by India. So he conquered all this area, clear up all Greece, and clear down into Egypt. Don't worry about Arabia, it's not worth it. So this was a big deal by the time he was 26. Now, to get to your point here, we're going to talk about this Cody, is that he divided up the area, his empire among his four different generals. But the main ones are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Seleucids were up here, the Ptolemies were here. And when he divided it right in the middle by the middle of the Middle East. And so these guys have tension among each other, okay? So sometimes they'll attack in here and they'll push the line, and the others attack up there and push. At least that's what they did for this one time. Where what happened was that was the center of where their conflict was. So what happens is the Ptolemies ruled Palestine. That's the people in Egypt, ruled Palestine from 320 to 198 BC, and they were considerate of Jewish worship. The Jews could worship like they wanted to. They didn't try to control their worship. The Seleucids were in the north, and they pushed the Ptolemies out, like I was saying. They pushed them down so that this line no longer was there, but it's down here, maybe by Gaza. And so when they pushed it down, they took over. They were just tolerant of Jewish worship at the beginning until 175. Then this new king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, comes on the scene at 175, from 175 to 164. He was different. He took over and wanted to set up what they called radical Hellenization. Everything you do is going to turn to Greek, including your religion. He tried to eradicate the Jewish religion, replace it with Hellenism or Greek culture and Greek gods. He prohibited Jewish practices, attempted to destroy all the copies of the Torah. Right? Can you imagine what the Jews would feel like? There'd be some anger there. He required offerings to be given to the Greek god Zeus. You're no longer going to have any offerings to Yahweh. The final straw that broke the back of the Jewish tolerance of the Seleucids was that Antiochus erected a statue of Zeus in the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar. Do you know anything about pigs and the Jews? They're unclean. How dare you even touch a pig and put him on an altar? What are you doing? You killed him. So this caused the Jewish revolt of the Maccabees in 166 BC. You can read about this in 1st Maccabees. You can also read about in Josephus. I've got a bunch of books here if you want to look at it. Josephus was a Jewish historian who also wrote about this at the time. So we've gone. Oh, what am I doing here? So now we've gone through Alexander the Great, and now we're going to talk about the Hasmonean period, which was when the Jews had rebelled. They rebelled against the Alexander and against the Antiochus Epiphanes and the Seleucids, and they became their own state in 166. It's called the Hasmonean period. The Jews revolted against Antiochus. The revolt was led by Matthias and his 5 sons. Judas, have you ever heard of Judas Maccabeus? Okay, that's the main guy. But Judas Maccabeus, Jonathan, Simon, John, and Eleazar, they destroyed the statue of Zeus. Let's cleanse this temple, and this triggered the Maccabean revolt. This all triggered a Maccabean revolt that lasted for 24 years. Jews were victorious and got their independence until the Romans came in 63. So here's what happened in that period there. The Jews began to take over again the different area here in Middle East, in Palestine. So this is like from 166 BC, they revolt. So they get control of Judea. And then in 160 to 162, these different brothers do some leading. He becomes, I think, a high priest, and Jonathan, and he takes over this other areas from the Seleucids. And then in 142 to 434, another one of the brothers takes it on and he gains some more land. And this continues. So they gain more land, and more land. So this is what it looks like at about 76 BC. The Jewish nation has expanded, still being controlled mainly by high priests and people, the religious people. So there you go. Now we're at 63 BC, and the Romans are going to come in. We're going to talk about Roman Jesus, the church, the end of the Jewish state. The Roman period begins in 63 BC. For some reason, there were some disagreements, and I can't remember exactly, but some of the Jews went to Rome and asked them to come and settle things. Well, they came and they took over everything. Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC. He lays siege to the temple for 3 months and then massacres the priests and enters the Holy of Holies. That is an abomination. That was not, you don't do that. As well as abomination when Antiochus Epiphanes did the same thing, and he did even more. The Jews as a whole never forgave Rome for this atrocity. So the Jews that believed in a Messiah that's coming, this sparked that to be more intense. This is 63 BC. They're looking forward now for someone, a Messiah, to come and deliver them and free them from the Romans and set up God's kingdom. So they think there's going to be a military Messiah coming, and he's going to just kick the Romans out, give the Jews back their land. They had all this, they made all that progress, and now the Romans just took them over. We're going to get rid of these Romans. By the end of the first, I think this is 117 AD, Rome had expanded to all this. It's a big empire, including, Middle East there, Palestine. And I want you to be aware of some significant literary works that came about at this period. And so the Romans are still in power until what? 470 AD or something. So they're going to stay in power all this time. There's different things that the Jews wrote. And one of these is the Septuagint, which is Septuagint means 70. And it was a translation of the Old Testament in Greek. You remember that Alexander came in and made everybody speak Greek. Well, a lot of the Jews then that were dispersed didn't necessarily know English, Hebrew very well. So now they have their own Bible. It became the Bible of the dispersion. And dispersion basically was that the Jews at this time, with Rome taking over and all the Roman roads and everything, all the ability to travel, all the ability to do all kinds of different economics and everything, the Jews spread to different parts of the empire. Okay? And so since they didn't know Hebrew as well when they spread, they still needed a Bible. So it was translated into Greek. And that's what they used. The Jews living outside of Palestine. There's also what's called the Apocrypha. We'll look at that. It's hidden writings and found in what we have in a Catholic Bible. We talked about that one other time. I think we talked about the Apocrypha a little bit. The Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll talk about those more. Social, political, religious. It's called, the Jews that were out in the area outside of Palestine were called the diaspora. They lived outside of Palestine. They prepared the way for the gospel. Synagogues were established where they worshiped God wherever there was 10 men. And so they didn't trust the women, I guess. But anyways, 10 men. And there were synagogues in Corinth, synagogues in Rome, synagogues in Egypt, synagogues all over. And so that became the center of the diaspora worship. And so you remember Paul, when he would go out there, he would go to the synagogues first. Go to the synagogue if you read in Acts. He'd go to the synagogues, he'd preach the gospel. That's where he started. The different parties that ruled was Sadducees was one of them. It was a temple party. They controlled the high priesthood and the temple that was built. The high priest presided over the Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish high council. Even under Roman rule, the Romans let them have their own high priest, but they selected which high priest they wanted. The Romans did. They want to keep control. But they also controlled, that way they controlled, the Sadducees controlled the priesthood. But the Sadducees they believed in the law, the Torah, but not necessarily the rest of the Old Testament, which would be what?
The non-Torah part of it, like so
Yeah.
Psalms, Proverbs.
Yeah. What else?
Late, prophets,
The prophets, that's right. They didn't believe the prophets.
Ecclesiastes.
Yeah. What about even the history?
Even the kings
Yeah.
and Samuel.
Yeah. I mean, they would understand that, but that wasn't what their focus was up on the law. They rejected the possibility of the resurrection. So if you're that way and you've killed somebody and somebody claims they're resurrected, what do? That can't be. So they're not going to accept that Jesus was resurrected. They did not believe in angels or demons or spirits, I think another place says. They did not believe in immortality of the soul. You just die. That's it. They did not believe in the coming of a personal Messiah. Why would they? I mean, they're ruling with Romans' blessings. If they thought a Messiah was coming to kick out Rome, that'd be opposite of what they believed. It would be a threat to them, and it was when Jesus was there. Then there's the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the other group of Jews that were a major group that were there. And they believed the law, but also the oral law. The oral law was the Jews took the law, and then they made little rules about the law. So you didn't break the law. So they put a fence around the law. For one of the things is, the law said you could only do a Sabbath day's journey on Sabbath. That was like 7/10 of a mile. But the Jews said, well, if the day before you put your shoe out there, you got to have your shoe, and then you put it out another 7/10, you're okay to go and do both those, go get both your shoes or whatever. They had all kinds of ways to overcome that. The Jewish laws about the law were written by people we'll talk about here in a minute, but it's called Mishnah. So if you go in here and you look at the Mishnah, these are commentaries on the law. Now, what happened was, a couple centuries later, the Jews that were still around, especially in Babylon or wherever, they would take this and make 10 more volumes out of it. It was called the Talmud. If you've ever heard of Talmud. So you had views about the law. You had commentary on the law, then you had a commentary on the Mishnah. But the Jew, and this all came from the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in the law, but also oral law, which was the Mishnah. They put heads around the written law so people would not break it. Be like, okay, so you're not supposed to park out here, let's say, for only 45 minutes. So maybe they have somebody there. They say, well, they would monitor it. I don't know if this, I'm trying to think up from my own mind, but they might have something be put there that would make you leave before 45 minutes are up. I don't know what that means, but anyway. But the Pharisees believed in a future life or immortality of the soul, which is opposite the Sadducees. They believed in angels and demons, the coming of the Messiah who would restore the fortunes of Israel. That is where the center of the belief in the Messiah coming was with the Pharisees. There's also another group we'll talk about more, Essenes, which is a communal group that didn't like how the Pharisees and the Sadducees were doing what they were doing in the temple. So they went down to the Dead Sea and they repudiated marriage. The discipline was severe and ritualistic. They made their own little community. so forth. Then there were the zealots. These people were part of they were a Jewish party interested in overthrowing Rome. They did not want Rome ruling them. And so one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, Simon the Zealot. Now it's interesting, Jesus pulled in all kinds of people. He had Levi, who was what? Remember what his profession was? Matthew.
Matthew was a tax collector.
Yes, his other name is Levi. So you got tax collectors on Jewish side, on the Roman side, they're collecting money for the Romans. Then you got the zealots who want to kill the Romans. How do you think it went with Simon and Matthew? If you've ever seen The Chosen, you feel some of that. They talk a little bit about that. So there was a lot of dynamics, but it was interesting. Jesus picked people from all kinds of different ways, places, and cultures to bring them together because he was going to make something special. So Jesus, in Luke 2, 1 through 20, and you hear this at Christmas time, in Matthew 1 through 20, 2, 1 through 20, Jesus was born in a manger, and put in a manger, in Bethlehem. Luke talks about that, but Matthew does not. Matthew talks about the wise men who see him, and they go and they have Herod has people come to kill all the babies that were 2 years and older. Older or younger? 2 years and younger. Because they wanted to make sure that this Messiah was not here. They don't want this king. Who's this king coming? And so there's two different genealogies, one in Luke and one in Matthew, and they look like they're contradicting each other. But basically, Matthew probably follows Joseph's line, and Luke follows Mary's. So this is why there's some differences. But Jesus begins his ministry at about 30 years old, and that is about, let's see when this was. Jesus was born about 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 BC. It wasn't 0, because they calculated it wrong. And then Jesus has his ministry for 3.5 years. He never traveled more than about 200 miles from his home. Remember, he went down to Egypt, so Herod wouldn't be able to get him. His parents took him down there. And there were 3 main stages of his ministry. He started in Galilee, basically then focused on Galilee to Jerusalem, and then he went to Jerusalem and he died. And there you go. He had ministry up here in Galilee. You can see of Galilee around here. They had ministry down this way. Not that he didn't go back and forth. It seems to be a concentration in Luke. And then he's in Judea for a while until he dies.
Is that kind of a desert area?
No, that was Samaria. Do you remember what Samaria was? You remember that the northern kingdom is the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom? Well, these Samaritans were the part of the northern kingdom. And they intermarried with the Assyrians, who took them over, because the Assyrians took their Jewish leaders over to Assyria, and the Assyrians sent back their leaders and put them in place. So over a period of time, the Samaritans interbreed, whatever you're going to call it, with the Assyrians. And so these 10 tribes up here, they call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel, they're considered evil by Judah. They're considered dirty. They're considered half-breeds in the old way of looking at racial things. They were not considered good. And so when Jesus goes back and forth through Samaria, he doesn't have a problem with it, but the Jews did, because you had the Judea Jews here and up here, and then you had the Samaritans, and they passed laws, that said that you can't go through Samaria and stop. You shouldn't even go through it, Samaria. You should go around across the Jordan River and go up here so you don't get contaminated. And whenever you're in Syria or Samaria, if you're going to go through there, you can't eat anything but such as can be peeled to get rid of the dirty stuff off of it so you can eat other things. And you wouldn't want to talk to anybody, especially on a woman, because men shouldn't talk to women outside, in public anyway, but a Samaritan woman, you remember Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman. It was totally taboo. You don't do things like that, Jesus. What's up with you? And he was breaking all these different things, different rules and laws and things like that. But he was there for people. He wasn't there for their law. And so, yes, they can go through Samaria, but you had really a lot of restrictions. The Samaritans, interestingly enough, also had their I think it was Samaria was their right here was their capital in the old northern kingdom. And after they got ostracized by the Jews, and they were deported and intermarried, they actually created their own Torah. There's what's called the Samaritan Torah. They had their own Old Testament and basically law. But that's something to look into if you want. But Jesus continues, and he chooses 12 people after praying all night, his disciples. They become leaders of the true church, or the true Israel, the church. And we can talk about what true is. But Jesus' death and resurrection comes about as the most important miracle of all of what Jesus did. But of course, the Sadducees don't want to accept that. Nor do other people, just didn't like Jesus. Well, how do you know that Jesus really existed? How do you know it wasn't just made up? When I was in Marquette University, a liberal Catholic university, our professor, Julian Hills, taught that the church made up all the miracles. The church made up all the things that were supernatural because they wanted that to happen. And then they put it in the Bible. The Jesus of the Bible isn't really who Jesus is. And so then a lot of these liberal scholars had what they call a search for the historical Jesus. We're going to find the real Jesus. And this guy was one of the guys, and he helped form a group that voted on which sayings would really be of Jesus and which wouldn't. So they went through and they took out all the different sayings of Jesus that they didn't think fit with what he would have done.
Oh, really?
And so they end up, yeah. They would vote. All the scholars that get together on this, I'm trying to think of the name of this group, but they would vote on they'd have different colors of things to cast to vote, whether you believe it's probably Jesus, I doubt that it's Jesus, or maybe it's possibly, but probably not Jesus, and certainly not Jesus. And so you had different colors, and so whenever they passed, or however they voted, you put your color in. And whoever had the most colors won, and they would take that out of the real Bible, that this really wasn't the case. But in their mind, they were trying to discover who the real Jesus was, because they didn't believe you could do miracles, you didn't believe, and it was a creation of the early church. That was a difficult class when I was in there. Anyway, but you can go back in history, you could find things that were written, although some people dispute it, by ancient historians that talk about Jesus. And one of them is historian Josephus. If you want to look at around the Jewish time and read about his about the history, then go check out this book for Josephus. In here he says, maybe on page 480. I got a ways to go. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to them both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, and the divine prophets, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. But if you don't want to believe that, you start saying, well, this was an addition later on by the church to Josephus, right? Is that mixing everybody up? But if you want to dig into the history, there's several books here you can look at. There's books on Alexander the Great. There's books on New Testament backgrounds, New Testament history. You can go and study all that. Probably the best book on looking at the backgrounds of the New Testament is a Greco-Roman world by a guy named Jeffers. It's really neat, really good. Now, if you want to study some of the original things about the Caesars, this is written by a person of that day who wrote about 12 different Caesars in Rome. His name is Suetonius, called the 12 Caesars. You can read about what was it like to be emperor. And another thing that's pretty neat, these are Christian fiction, if you will, but it's a week in the life of Corinth. What he does is he takes the historical background and brings you into what it would have been like to live there for a week. And this is another called the Lost Letters of Pergamum, and you would do the same thing, only it'd be for the city of Pergamum. They're historical fiction, such that the real life things are there that you might be able. If you want to know what it's like to be in that day, it would help. I've got some information also on the real Jesus, and there's something about the hard sayings of Jesus, if you want to look at that. But in my mind, there's no reason not to believe Jesus was real. Historian Josephus mentions Jesus. Roman historian Tacitus mentions him. Roman writer Lucian mentions him. The Jewish Babylonian Talmud mentions him too. This is in our book. If you got Oak's book, you can read that. So, anyway, that is the end of, just about the end of when Jesus was. But here's the Temple Mount as it looks today. You've got, this is looking from the Mount of Olives, basically looking west. This was the temple area here. And you're up on the Mount of Olives up here. Down below is where Jesus prayed. And they rested him. You've got an incredible temple type thing here. It's called the Dome of the Rock. It's the second highest, most precious place for the Islamic religion. And it's incredible. And so think about it, that's built where the temple was. How do you think the Jews feel about that? That's why there's so much tension there. The Arabs claim this, and so does Israel. You got this fighting all the time. In the Garden of Eden, you find these old trees. What's that? Yeah, in Garden. What did I say? Sorry. Yeah, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was. These are the ancient olive trees that are probably 2,000 years old. There's a bunch of them in there. I think they look like Daleks. I don't know if you ever watched Doctor Who. There's head things coming out. Anyway, forget that. Anyway, let's go on some more. Here's another one. Here's ancient. It's interesting. These sprout from inside and go out.
They're protected over there.
Well, that part's protected.
Yeah.
You can go in there. It's all fenced around. You go in there and you can pray. And there's a place there you can have a lectern, and they have a little bit of a place you can sit down and people can speak and things. But yeah, it's one of the biggest tourist places.
Wow.
Now this is like what it would have been like possibly for the tomb that Jesus was in you have this big rock, which is cut out of stone. It's round, and they just roll it shut when they put somebody in there, and then they roll it back when they want to put another person in there. So that's sort of what it looks like. That's what they found on, but we've got some others too that we'll go into archaeology. Now, we want to look at the birth and expansion of the church. So Jesus has died and resurrected, and 50 days later, the church begins with the Holy Spirit coming in Acts chapter 2, and you got tongues of fire, and you got all these other things. The book of Acts covers roughly 30 years of history of the early church. Can someone read Acts 1:8? Does anyone have Acts 1:8? What's Acts 1:8 say?
I got it.
Okay, thanks. Cody.
But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witness in Jerusalem and all of Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth.
Okay, Jesus said that when he, before he ascended, and he said, "You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." And that's what the outline of the book of Acts looks like. The first, well, that's what it looks like. Up until Acts 13, you have Judea, and then it goes into Samaria, and then it goes into the ends of the earth. But the book of Acts then also from Acts chapter 13 on talks about the missionary journeys of Paul. And they all begin from Antioch in Syria. So this is the first missionary journey. Paul, after he's converted, is up in Antioch. See this Antioch? It's not this Antioch. This is the Antioch of Syria. And this is where they sent him and Barnabas out, and later on him and some others. So he comes down here, and he goes through here, and he preaches the gospel up here. He gets beat up here. All kinds of things happen. He comes back, and he reports back to Antioch. And they start a lot of churches. So the gospel has started to spread out. Remember that we talked about the synagogues that the Pharisees would start in various parts of the world, and Paul would go there first because they had an understanding of the Old Testament. They understood some of the prophecy. They understood about God, and so he'd start there. And so this was from about 48 A.D. to about 49 A.D. And then in 50 he starts on another. So again, he starts at Antioch, comes around here, and he visits some of these churches that he had before started. Then he goes up here, and I think it's here where, remember, he wanted to go up north. I think it's there that Paul says he was stopped by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit wouldn't let him go north. He had him come over to Troas, and there's a person there, and there's another person asking him to come up here. Troas, he goes across the ocean here, the Aegean Sea. Which all of these different places. Philippi, later on he writes to the Philippians. Neapolis, Epiphalis, Thessalonica, he wrote the books to the Thessalonians later on. Berea, he comes down here and goes to Athens, and he goes to Corinth, comes back and goes to Ephesus. You got the book of Ephesians, and he goes back this way, and he comes down to Jerusalem. Then he goes back up to Antioch. So Antioch is his key place. Then the third missionary journey, he again is in Antioch. They send him out again. He goes through these different places. Goes to Ephesus. He goes up around in here. Goes around, to Corinth and back, and then he goes back again. He comes back and he goes into Jerusalem. And there he gets arrested. And so that was from 54 to 58 AD. And then he gets on a boat. He was arrested, and he appeals to Caesar for his case. And they take him up here and put him on a boat. And this is in the fall, and it's just not good weather. And he goes around here. All of a sudden, he's down here by Fair Havens, and the wind, a big storm comes, and just blows his boat out here as a prisoner. He wanders for 2 weeks in this no man's land water, and he lands on Malta, and then they take him up to Rome. So Paul is in Rome. Now, this handout that I gave you, all this is talked about when you go here, the second page and so forth. It talks about how the whole New Testament is put together and what was happening where and when he visited Corinth, when he visited other places in a chronological way. And so if you want to look at that and study that, feel free to do that. And also there's one about the chronology of Paul's life. And then when you come to this page where it talks about Apocrypha, we'll talk about that later. But I just gave you that so that you could read about it, you can study it, because there's a history behind it. So Paul then is taken to Rome. He's imprisoned, and he's there, I think, at least 2 years, and that comes to the end of the book of Acts. Well, that's about, what did we say, about 60 AD, somewhere around there, 58, I can't remember what it was exactly. But Paul is then, is either killed there, or he's let go and he goes on a fifth missionary journey over to Spain. We're just not sure. We don't have information on that. But I think Paul was beheaded in Rome. Peter was also in Rome. He didn't want to be crucified like Jesus was, so they crucified him upside down. So a lot of these were martyrs. So what's going on in the bigger picture of the Roman Empire? Well, we're going to look at that. From 70 AD to 135, the Romans take Jerusalem and destroy the temple in 70 AD. How many times has this temple been destroyed? It's interesting that Herod the Great was creating a new temple. He was developing that one temple that was finished supposedly in 515, but he was developing it more and more, and he made this pretty grand temple, but it didn't get done till about 62 AD, or 63, 64, just before the Romans came in and destroyed it. So the Romans come in and destroy the temple. They level it totally. They didn't want these Jews ever bothering anything again. And we're going to look at Masada, which was the last holdout of the Jews. But at this time, there's no more Sadducees. The temple is destroyed. That's their home. That's where they live. That's where they rule. It's gone. So there's no more Sadducees. The Pharisees still continue. They become the custodian of Judaism because there's no Sadducees. Their center of operations is a city in Palestine called Jamnia. They begin to preserve and consolidate and reorganize and write down their oral law, which is what the Mishnah was that I showed you. We now have it as a Mishnah. They also set the boundaries of Jewish canon, Old Testament. So they were the ones that helped develop, okay, what's in the Bible, what should be, what shouldn't be. There you go again with the temple, with the dome of the rock. Now, all that's left of part of the temple today, do you know what that is? No. It's called the Wailing Wall. You ever heard of that? Yeah, this is one where they go and they pray, and they put their little prayers inside the wall. This is probably not part of the temple. It's probably part of what's left over, part of a retaining wall. But it's the only thing left of that temple in 70 AD. And the Jews still come there and they pray. Okay, here's this guy praying. Now look at all these little prayers. See all these things? You stuff them in there. All stuff. Now, he's got a hat on. They won't let you go up to the temple wall unless you have a hat on.
Well, unless you have one?
You have to have some type of hat, whether it's those, whatever they call them, or some type of hat. So I had a cap, so that's why they didn't crucify me or something. Anyway, it was hot there that day. But this is interesting too. They had two places. great big one for men to go up, and a little tiny one for women to go up. Now, women were supposed to not turn their back. They had to walk backwards. You find some not doing it. But once they went to the wall, they had to walk backwards to get out. They weren't supposed to.
Just the women have to?
Yeah. Yeah, I had my back to the wall in that picture for me.
Yeah, I didn't see
Well, we had a person that who didn't like that. She was going to go to the men's wall. I said, no, you're not. You're going to be in trouble with those. You're supposed to be part of our group, and you do that, we may have to go rescue you out of prison or something. Anyway, they have some pretty strict laws. And so you've got this wailing wall, and I don't know if I have another, no, I don't, okay. Anyway, that's what they do there for praying. They go and pray, and they're hoping for the restoration of the Jewish state. Not just Jewish, the Messiah coming. Because the Jewish state is now, they have a new Jewish state. So I want to look at Masada. This is what it looks like out by the Dead Sea. It's the last holdout of the Jewish zealots. Remember, the zealots were people who were trying to overthrow Rome. When Rome came in and they destroyed the temple, these guys fled. And they went to this place called Masada, which was a fortress built by Herod, I believe Herod the Great, to protect. It was a summer resort, basically, but it was also a fortress. People couldn't climb around. You couldn't get it in there anyway. They've got a tram that takes you up there now. They had pools here, pools there. They had all kinds of storage area for their grain, and they had all kinds of cisterns. Whenever it rained there, all the water would be brought and taken out and put in the cisterns, and they'd use that to irrigate and make some new crops. There's what it looks like. You remember I said it's impenetrable almost? You can't get through it. It's just it's just hard. Well, the Roman says we're going to get those guys. Here's an old Roman camp right there. There's another one over here somewhere. They found it. They take, and see how this was a ravine clear down here? They take a couple of years to build that up with dirt. Make that ramp. They built that, yeah, that right thing. That's a ramp. They built that ramp because we're going to get you guys. You're not going to last here very long. And there's the one of the encampments they found. There's your thing. They built the ramp. They're building up there.
still there?
Yeah. Here's what it looks like from the top. I took that picture. You're on top. They build it clear up to where you're at. And so the Romans got that built clear up there, and then they got inside. Let me go backwards. They got inside there, and these zealots, I don't remember how many people there were, but they had women and kids. And the zealots drew lots as to who was going to kill everybody. So they committed suicide, or else they killed each other. There was only like 8 women and children left that they found. So it frustrated the Romans. They spent 2 years building this thing to get these guys. And these guys killed themselves. Or killed each other. So they only got some women and children. And so it was a terrible time. Well, after this, that was in 73 AD. After this, the only other thing that happens that's really important, I think, in historically, is that the Jews aren't going to give up. They want to get rid of these Romans. So in 132 AD, a man named Simon Bar Kokhba claimed to be the Messiah. And he got all kinds of people with him. All the Jewish support, the Pharisees support him. And he led a revolt. The Romans come in, and at 135, they put it down soundly. No more Jewish state. You guys are done. And this was the last of any type of Jewish nation until the 20th century. It was also the last revolt against Rome by the Jews. They're squashed. Well, here's another look at so that's the end of our time period, except for the new state in 1948, which was built after World War II. But this is a little closer look to that Dome of the Rock, which the Jews despise. This is incredible. Look at the
Oh,
mosaic.
that's the one that is all, oh, yes.
The mosaic. It's
That's
just
beautiful.
incredible how they did that. You go and look at it's all intricate stuff. Now, they used to let anybody go in and see inside there. Supposedly there's a slab of rock where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac.
Oh,
Okay, and so it's a place covering that because that's a common thing between them because the Jews and the Muslims trace their religion back to Abraham. But the Jews don't like that.
Can you get up closer to that? By any chance?
I do have a closer picture, but not in this one. We'll look at that later, I think. Yeah, it's incredible. So we had to walk around it. We could walk around and look at it, but we couldn't get inside.
Oh,
So now we're leaving, going down the different rocks and stuff, different steps.
did you find it hard to get around there? This is-
Well, it wasn't too bad. It was just hot. You had to take your water with you. Just hot. They had some of these Jewish people. You probably heard in the Gaza War that some of the Jews are exempt from military service. You ever hear any of that? And they're paid by the state. They're actually ministers. They're actually Jewish rabbis paid to continue what they do. All they do is the religious things all the rest of their life. And they're exempt from service. Well, we were following a guy. This guy was tall. He had a black hat. Linda, did he have these curl things? What was it he had? He had his hair, but it was a big long beard. And he had curls on his hair down like that. It was a special thing that those guys did.
Well, it was the law that you can't shave your face. They didn't know where their face started. So they went behind their ears. They had to let their sideburns grow.
Okay, yeah. You have to be particular about that. So Cody, you need to watch out. Now, okay, now this is historically when these books of the New Testament were written. They aren't in chronological historical order as they are in the New Testament. They weren't written that way. You've got Galatians, which is probably the first one. Paul writes to Galatia, the area that he'd done some of his missionary journey. James is probably second. James, the brother of the Lord, wrote James. First and Second Thessalonians are probably 51 and 50. First Corinthians 51 to 56. First Second Corinthians. Romans probably 57. Mark is the first gospel that we have, probably 55 to 60. They do think that there might have been a gospel of Matthew might have been written in Aramaic, which was the Jewish language of the day, and then translated into Greek. We're not sure. We don't have any evidence of that. Just one.
Dr. Luke there.
Yeah, Dr. Luke.
So that
He
is-
was a doctor.
Oh,
He's
he
the one
was?
that. What's that?
He was a doctor.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a physician in that day, and he wrote Luke and Acts. And this is his first volume, which was Luke, and then the second volume, a little bit later, Acts. You've got Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians, Philippians, the book of Acts, 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy, Hebrews, maybe, we don't know when Hebrews was. Somebody, different people think it was Paul, Barnabas, or Apollos, something. Some people think it was Priscilla who wrote it. But in that day, they wouldn't let women have that.
No.
Anyway, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Matthew, the Gospels of Luke, then Jude, Jesus' second brother that wrote. 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation, which is just by the Apostle John. He was almost 100 years old at that time, they think. So the last one, so they were written from 49 AD to about 96 AD. And so that's more the historical order that they're written in. And what's neat is all these different things that Paul wrote can be fit into the book of Acts. And that's sort of what that historical chart does that you have here. So here we go. we at? What's it doing? Oh, here we go. So you're going to Abraham, you're going to Isaac, you're going to Jacob, you're going to Joseph, you're going to Jacob's family leaving or going to Egypt. And Moses and him bringing the Exodus, bringing them out of Egypt. You got the judges, you got the kings, which is Saul and then David, then Solomon, and you got the northern kingdom, which gets taken to Assyria, and you got the southern kingdom, it lasts a little longer, taken to Babylon, and then there's a period when nothing's happening, and the captives come back from Babylon, they rebuild the walls and the temple of Jerusalem. You got the last writing of the Old Testament, Malachi. You've got then this period, then when there's not a whole lot going on there, but then you have Alexander the Great come on. He Hellenizes everything. He makes everything like it should be if you're going to be a good Greek. And but his Antiochus Epiphanes and his different generals and their successive people aren't friendly to the Jews, and so the Jews rebel. Maccabean period or Hasmonean period. Then the Romans take over, and they desecrate the temple, and then during this time they're looking for a Messiah to get rid of Rome. And so Jesus comes on the scene when there is a lot of talk about the Messiah. There's a lot. People are looking for the Messiah. And so Jesus is born, Jesus dies and resurrects, the church begins. Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. You got Simon Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD. That's the end of the Jewish state until 1948 when Israel comes back. There you go.
How many years did Paul live?
It's probably about 65, something like that. He died, I think, around that time too. Yeah. The only one that lasted a lot longer was John, who was probably about 100 years old. Now, John, it's interesting that the church fathers write about John that he was so old he couldn't do much. They would bring him into church on a stretcher, and he would be there. But the only thing he could say would be, "Love one another." That's his preaching. Love one another. And you read his word, his writings, and that's what it was. So you get then in the future, destruction of this age and the lake of fire, then the creation of new heaven and new earth. And that's it. One more thing. I mean, is that helpful? Does that give you a big picture of what's going on? The whole Bible history, just so you get a sketch of what's happening. And if you know where these books fit in, you can plug it in. Oh, yeah, I know what's going on here. I know what's going on there. This front page, I just want to look at it on this extra handout, called the Bible Translations. I want to look at that just briefly. Have you ever wondered why there's so many translations? What would be a good translation? I don't know. It's probably 50, 60, 70. I don't know.
They're all a little different.
Well, just to give you some background, there's a different way of translating the Greek and Hebrew. And if you look at the top there, there's a literal, and that line at the top, there's literal translation, which means one word will always be translated a certain way whenever it appears, just about, in the book. So you can't have variations in that word. It's like the word rock will always be rock, or the word, I'm trying to think of a good one, fear might always be fear, not reverence, things like that. Anyway, you look across over here, KJV means King James Version, NASB is a literal, and ASV, also ESV would be here. Okay? And then, as you're going to the right, you come to what's called dynamic equivalent. And what they're saying is that the translators are trying to have, instead of word for word, they're trying to do idea to idea. And so they get the idea, what are these several words together mean in that day? How would it mean? What would it mean today? And so they're getting this dynamic equivalent. You see, you got NRSV, RSV, then you got NIV, which is what we usually use. NAB, then Jerusalem Bible, then GNB, Good News Bible, and then there's also the very free translation, which is not really a translation. It's really what do they call it? paraphrased. And you have the Message, Living Bible, and the New Living Bible. Not the New Living Translation, New Living Bible. Now, what happens is, as you progress this way, there's more and more chance that a person's going to put their own theology into it.
Yeah.
Because you're thinking ideas to ideas. Well, these words to words. So literal is good. It's good to also do the dynamic equivalent. I usually stay away from the others because there's a lot that people can put in of their own ideas if you go too far to the right. And so you can read about that in this page, and hopefully that'll help you understand what these different Bibles are. And if you come across some ESV, there's other Bibles too. RSV is Revised Standard. Well, let me go through this. King James Version, NASB. I think New King James Version is probably here too. NASB is New American Standard Bible. ASV is American Standard Version. RSV is Revised Standard. Then there's a New Revised Standard, which moved more toward dynamic equivalent. You've got NIV, NAB, New American Bible, New English Bible. NIV is New International Version. G and B, I believe, is Good News Bible. JB is Jerusalem Bible. And then on the other side, you get the Message, Living Bible, and New Living Bible. So, just so you're aware, I think it's better to stay in the middle or to the left if you're really going to study out the word.
I have that one is called, what's it called, the Passion Version?
Oh, there's a Passion Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where that one's at. I think the Passion is probably in the middle there somewhere.
Oh, this,
There's also the Amplified Bible.
yeah.
You ever seen the Amplified Bible? It takes each word, several words as it translates and puts in parentheses the various definitions of the word.
Like
So
a
you mean-
thesaurus.
What?
It's like a
Yeah.
thesaurus.
And so you can figure out what you want. But it makes it pretty long, but it gives you a sense of what the dynamic aspects of the semantic range of that word is, so that you can sort of feel out, oh, it might mean this, might mean that. So you got those. Any questions?